I'm Michelle Mikes, the K-12 Mathematics Supervisor for the Cobb County School District. Our district is committed to helping students succeed, and you as parents are an integral part of this process. To help keep you informed about what your child is learning in our math classrooms, we are excited to provide you with these informational videos on concepts taught throughout the school year. Thank you for taking the time to discover ways to support your students' learning.
Welcome to the 5th grade, Unit 4, Adding, Subtracting, Multiplying, and Dividing Fractions video. My name is Miranda Westbrook, the K-5 Professional Learning Specialist for the Cobb County School District. In this unit, students will use equivalent fractions to add and subtract fractions, solve word problems involving all operations of fractions, explain a fraction as division of the numerator by the denominator, explain the product of a whole number and a fraction and the product of two fractions, find the area of a rectangle with fractional sides, explain the results of multiplying a fraction by a number greater than 1 and less than 1, explain the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa, find the quotient for the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa, and make and solve problems with measurements in fractions of a unit on a line plot. In the first segment of the video, we'll look at standard NF1. Add and subtract fractions and mixed numbers with unlike denominators by finding a common denominator and equivalent fractions to produce like denominators. And standard NF2. Solve word problems involving addition and subtraction of fractions, including cases of unlike denominators. Standard NF1 builds on the work in 4th grade where students add and subtract fractions with like denominators. For example, in the problem 3/4 plus 2/4, we can use a visual model to see that 3/4 plus 2/4 equals 5/4, which equals 1 and 1/4. In another example, 1 and 3/4 minus 2/4, the model represents 1 and 3/4, and if we subtract 2/4, we get a difference of 1 and 1/4. In 5th grade, students are required to find a common denominator by finding the product of both denominators. This process should be introduced using fraction visual models. Let's look at an example with addition. 1/3 plus 1/2. We can represent this problem with fraction towers. Students should apply their understanding of equivalent fractions and their ability to rewrite fractions in an equivalent form to find common denominators. They should understand that multiplying the denominators will always give a common denominator, but may not result in the smallest denominator. In this example, 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6, and 1/2 is equivalent to 3/6. 2/6 plus 3/6 equals 5/6. Let's look at a subtraction example. 3/4 minus 1/3. The model shows 3/4. If we multiply the denominators, 4 and 3, we know that 12 is a common denominator. 3/4 is equal to 9/12, and 1/3 is equal to 4/12. The model shows 3/4. We can partition the model to reflect the common denominator of 12ths. The model now shows 9/12, which is equal to 3/4. We need to subtract 1/3, which is equal to 4/12. And if we subtract 4/12, we find a difference of 5/12. So 9/12 minus 4/12 equals 5/12. Let's look at some word problems with fraction addition and subtraction. Ellen has 2.5 gallons of lemonade to sell at her lemonade stand. She sold 1 2/3 gallons. How many gallons of lemonade does she have left? We need to subtract 2.5 minus 1 2/3 to find the amount of lemonade that Ellen has left. The model represents 2.5 gallons of lemonade. If we multiply the denominators 2 and 3, we see that 6 is a common denominator. So 2.5 equals 2 3/6, and 1 2/3 equals 1 4/6. Our problem is now 2 3/6 minus 1 4/6. We can partition the model into 6 to represent this. The model shows 2 3/6 gallons of lemonade. We need to subtract 1 4/6 gallons since this is the amount that Ellen has already sold. The model shows that Ellen has 5-6 gallons of lemonade left to sell. Another way that students can solve this problem is by creating equivalent improper fractions. For example, 2 3/6 is equal to 15/6, and 1 4/6 is equal to 10/6. Students can subtract 10/6 from 15/6 to get a difference of 5/6. In an addition example, DeAndre drinks 3/4 cups of water with lunch and 1 1/8 cups of water with dinner. How many cups of water did DeAndre drink? We need to add 3/4 plus 1 1/8 to find the amount of water that DeAndre drank. The model shows 3/4. Since one of the denominators is eighths, and I know that 4 times 2 is 8, I can find a common denominator with eighths. 3/4 equals 6/8. An equivalent problem is 6/8 plus 1 1/8. We can partition the model to show 6/8. Now if we add 1 1/8, we can add the parts of the model to find that 6/8 plus 1 1/8 equals 1 7/8. So DeAndre drank 1 7/8 cups of water. In the next segment of the video, we'll look at standard NF3, interpret a fraction as division of the numerator by the denominator. Students need ample experiences to explore the concept that a fraction is a way to represent the division of two quantities. For example, 2 small pizzas are shared equally by 4 people. What fraction of a pizza will each person get? We can represent this problem with a model. 2 small pizzas partitioned into fourths since we are sharing with 4 people. We can then shade the pizzas to represent the amounts that each person will get. The model shows that each person will get 2/4 of a pizza, so 2 divided by 4 equals 2/4. Each person gets 2/4, which is equal to 1/2 of a small pizza. After multiple experiences with sharing problems, students learn that 2/4 can also be interpreted as 2 divided by 4. In the next segment, we'll look at standard NF4, apply and extend previous understandings of multiplication to multiply a fraction or whole number by a fraction. We will also look at word problems with multiplication. In 4th grade, students worked with recognizing that a whole number times a fraction, such as 5 times 1/6, can be represented as 5 groups of 1/6. This concept can be demonstrated with fraction towers, number lines, and repeated addition. Each representation shows that 5 times 1/6 equals 5/6. In 5th grade, students revisit this concept and they also investigate fraction by fraction multiplication using visual area models. Let's consider the example 1/2 times 1/3. The model shows 1/3. We need to find 1/2 of 1/3. The model now shows 1/2 of 1/3. The overlap shows the product in relationship to the whole. The yellow is the overlap between 1/2 and 1/3, which represents 1/6 of the whole. So 1/2 times 1/3 equals 1/6. Let's look at an example of a word problem with multiplication. Jane has 5/6 of a brownie. She eats 2/3 of the brownie for dessert. What fraction of a whole brownie did Jane eat? We need to find 2/3 of 5/6 in order to determine the fraction of a whole brownie that Jane ate. The model represents the 5/6 of the brownie that Jane has. She eats 2/3 of the 5/6 brownie. If we merge the two models together, we can represent 2/3 of 5/6. The yellow overlap shows 2/3 of 5/6, which represents 10/18 of the whole brownie. So Jane ate 10/18 of the whole. If we divide both the numerator and denominator by 2, we find that 10/18 is equivalent to 5/9. Students spend time building and analyzing models in order to develop number sense and conceptual understanding of multiplication with fractions. After conceptual understanding has been established, students move on to the rule or algorithm of multiplying the numerators and the denominators to find the product. Standard NF4 also calls for students to find the area of a rectangle with fractional side lengths. In the next section of this video, we'll look at an example of finding the area of a rectangle with fractional sides. Let's consider this problem. A classroom carpet has a length of 3 1/4 yards and a width of 1 2/3 yards. What is the area of the classroom carpet? To find the area, we can decompose the fractions to show the length and width of the carpet as 3 plus 1/4 and 1 plus 2/3. We can then use the distributive property to build an area model and find the partial products. 3 times 1 equals 3. 1 times 1/4 equals 1/4. 2/3 times 3 equals 6/3 or 2. And 2/3 times 1/4 equals 2/12. Now we need to add the partial products of 3 plus 2 plus 1/4 plus 2/12 to find the total product. After finding a common denominator, we know that an equivalent problem is 3 plus 2 plus 3/12 plus 2/12, which equals 5 5/12. The carpet has a total area of 5 5/12 square yards. In the next section of the video, we'll look at standard NF5, interpret multiplication as scaling or resizing. This standard calls for students to examine the magnitude of products in terms of the relationship between two types of problems. For example, Mr. Jones teaches in a room that is 60 feet wide and 40 feet long. Mr. Thomas teaches in a room that is half as wide but has the same length. How do the dimensions and area of Mr. Thomas's classroom compare to Mr. Jones's room? Since Mr. Thomas's room is half as wide as Mr. Jones's room, the factor of 60 is halved, which is equal to 30 feet. Since one of the factors was halved, the product will also be halved. If Mr. Jones's classroom has an area of 2,400 square feet, then Mr. Thomas's classroom will have an area that is half that. So half of 2,400 is 1,200. So Mr. Thomas's classroom has an area of 1,200 square feet. Therefore, the relationship between the problems of 40 times 60 and 40 times 30 is halved. If the factor is halved, the product will be halved. Standard NF5 also calls for students to explain the results of multiplying a fraction by a number greater than or less than 1. For example, Julie is calculating the product of 2 2/3 times 8. Estimate the product of Julie's problem. Since 2 groups of 8 is 16 and 2 2/3 is almost 3 groups of 8, the product will be greater than 16, but less than 24. Let's look at another example. Chance is calculating the product of 1/2 times 3/4. Will the product be greater than or less than 1? The product will be less than 1 because we are multiplying by fractions that are less than 1. Let's look at this with a model. Here the model shows 3/4, and here the model shows 1/2. We are trying to find 1/2 of 3/4. If we merge the two models, the dark purple represents the overlap between 1/2 and 3/4. The dark purple represents 3/8 of the whole. So the product will be less than 1 because Chance is calculating 1/2 of 3/4, and 1/2 of 3/4 is equal to 3/8, which is less than 1. In the next segment of the video, we'll investigate standard NF7, which calls for students to explain the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa, and for students to find the quotient for the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa. We will also look at word problems involving division of fractions. Let's start by looking at the example 1 divided by 1/12. Consider this problem context. Myra has one candy bar. She cuts the candy bar into 12ths. How many pieces does Myra have? Myra has 12 pieces because one candy bar divided by 1/12 equals 12 pieces. Now let's consider 1/3 divided by 2. Consider this context. Myra has 1/3 of a candy bar. She divides the piece of candy into 2 parts to share with a friend. What fraction of a whole candy bar will each friend get? Each friend will get 1/6 of a whole candy bar because 1/3 divided by 2 equals 1/6. Let's look at another fraction word problem with division. Ashley has 1/4 of a bag of candy. She shares the bag of candy with 2 of her friends. What fraction of a bag of candy will Ashley and her friends get? We can represent this problem with a model to show 1/4 bag of candy. The bag of candy will be shared with 3 people, Ashley and her 2 friends. We can divide the 1/4 bag of candy among the 3 people. This model represents that. Each person will get 1/12 of a bag of candy. So 1/4 divided by 3 equals 1/12 of a bag. In the final segment of the video, we'll look at Standard MD2, make and solve problems with measurements in fractions of a unit on a line plot. Standard MD2 calls for students to make a line plot to display a data set of measurements in fractions of a unit using halves, fourths, and eighths. Students use operations of fractions at the 5th grade level to solve problems involving information presented in line plots. For example, the line plot shows the amount of rainfall in inches for the month of November. Students will use this information to solve problems such as, how many days in November received more than a ½ inch of rain? If we count the number of days that had more than ½ an inch, we see that 12 days received more than ½ an inch of rain. In another example, how many total inches of rain fell in the month of November? If we look at the line plot, we see that 6 days had 0 inches of rain. 3 days had 1/8 inch of rain. If we add 1/8 inch 3 times, we get a total of 3/8 inches of rain. Next on the line plot, we see that 5 days had 1/4 of an inch of rain. If we multiply 5 times 1/4, we get a total of 1 1/4 inches of rain. To add all of the inches of rain together, we'll need to find a common denominator of eighths. 1 1/4 is equal to 1 2/8 inches. Next on the line plot, we see that 0 days had 3/8 inches of rain. 4 days had ½ of an inch of rain. 4 times 1/2 equals 2 inches of rain. 0 days had 5/8 of an inch of rain. Next, we see that 4 days had 3/4 of an inch of rain. 4 times 3/4 is equal to 12/4, which equals 3 inches of rain. 3 days had 7/8 inches of rain, which equals 21/8 or 2 5/8 inches of rain. 5 days had 1 inch of rain. So if we multiply 5 times 1, we need to add a total of 5 inches of rainfall for the month of November. If we add all of these sums together, 3/8 plus 1 2/8 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 5/8 plus 5, we get a total sum of 13 10/8, which is equal to 14 2/8 inches of rain. If we divide the numerator and denominator by 2, we find that there were 14 1/4 inches of rain in the month of November. In this video, we have used equivalent fractions to add and subtract fractions, solved word problems involving all operations of fractions, explained a fraction as division of the numerator by the denominator, explained the product of a whole number and a fraction and the product of 2 fractions, found the area of a rectangle with fractional sides, explained the results of multiplying a fraction by a number greater than 1 and less than 1, explained the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa, found the quotient for the division of a unit fraction by a whole number and vice versa, and solved word problems with measurements in fractions of a unit on a line plot.
Thank you for your time. We know that when families and schools work together, student success increases. Please visit the Cobb County Math Department website for additional information and resources to support your student at home.